Before we delve into this realistic and disturbing story, I have a simple invitation for you. If you enjoy deep narratives, mysteries based on true stories, and tales that leave a lasting impression, subscribe to the channel now. That way, you won't miss any stories like this one. And feel free to tell me in the comments, where are you watching this video from? Sometimes old stories cross countries, decades, and arrive exactly where you are now. In the winter of 1912, the small town of Black Hollow, nestled among dense forests and ancient coal mines of Pennsylvania, it seemed to live outside of time. Industrial progress passed through it like a distant train, audible, inevitable, but never truly present. Wooden houses creaked in the biting wind, and the constant soot gave the sky a grey hue even on clear days. It was in this scenario that Elias Crowford, he returned after a 15-year absence. He didn't return out of longing, nor out of regret. He returned because he had been summoned. The letter, short and written in a stiff handwriting, mentioned no emotions, only facts. A body found. Inexplicable circumstances. His name mentioned in the city's old records. Elias was now a practical man, shaped by urban hospitals and scientific corridors. He worked as an assistant medical investigator in Chicago, specializing in industrial deaths, factory accidents, human error, gears crushing bones. Everything had a cause, a pattern, and an explanation. The supernatural for him was nothing more than organized ignorance. Black Hollow represented the opposite of that. Upon arriving, he realized that the city didn't welcome him, it merely tolerated him. Eyes averted, doors closed too soon, conversations ceased when he passed. There was no open hostility, but a silent agreement. Some things should not be revisited. The body that had motivated his return belonged to Margaret Bellows, a worker from the old textile factory, abandoned since 1899. She was found inside the building, lying on the floor of the boiler room, with her eyes open and her hands clenched as if she had tried to grasp something invisible. There were no signs of a struggle, no external injuries, no clear cause of death. The detail that worried local authorities was not included in the official report. Margaret's pocket watch had stopped exactly at 3:17 a.m. The same time of day was recorded in 5 other deaths over the past 20 years. The person in charge of the local investigation was Thomas Hargreave, the police chief since before the factory closed. A robust man with a rigid demeanor, known for maintaining order more through silence than force. For Thomas, the city functioned like a fragile organism. Stirring up old wounds too much could kill it for good, and Elijah was a risk. The old factory, known among residents as the Block, it was the economic heart of Black Hollow. By 1912, all that remained was a decaying structure, broken windows and corridors overtaken by rust and mold. Officially, it had closed after an accidental fire that killed dozens of immigrant workers. Unofficially, no one ever agreed on what really happened that night. Elias knew that story. He had been there, not as a worker, but as a son of Samuel Crowford, the factory's chief engineer. A respected, meticulous man who disappeared shortly after the fire, leaving only rumors and a name that was never spoken aloud again. The conflict lay not only in the current mystery, but in the weight of the past that Elias had tried to bury. As he walked around the factory grounds, he noticed something that bothered him more than the building's state of decay. People were still avoiding the place as if it was still active. There were no children playing nearby, not even animals. Nature seemed to be receding from that space. Inside the building, the air was heavy and still. Each step echoed unevenly, as if the space had the wrong dimensions. Margaret's broken clock had been found intact, with no visible mechanical damage. Elias examined it right there, trying to force a rational explanation. He didn't find any. The most disturbing element wasn't death itself, but the repetition, the pattern, the precision. The way everything pointed to something that remained the same, unchanged over decades, indifferent to time and people. Elias didn't believe in curses, but I believed in hidden causes. And Black Hollow was hiding something that no longer wanted to remain buried. Black Hollow revealed its layers only to those who insisted on looking beyond the obvious. In the light of day, it seemed like just another decaying industrial town, marked by sunken roofs and facades that were never repainted after the factory fire. But at night, the place took on a different nature. The streets emptied far too soon, and the silence wasn't comfortable, it was watchful. Elias quickly began to understand that the city operated under unwritten rules. People always gathered in the same places, spoke only when necessary, and avoided mentioning specific dates. The year 1912, in particular, was treated as forbidden territory. There were no complete records at the town hall. Newspapers from that time had torn or burned pages. Even the local church kept a strange gap in its death registers. The first character to approach, albeit cautiously, was Ruth Calderuth, the city's informal librarian and archivist. A thin woman with a perpetually tense expression, who seemed to carry the weight of stories she never told. Ruth didn't ask direct questions, but observed Elias as if trying to gauge how far someone could go before breaking. She was the one who revealed that Margaret Bellows was not the first to die inside the factory after its official closure. There were other names, few, always spaced years apart, always people connected in some way to the old workings of the building, children of workers, former supervisors, night watchmen. No similar deaths, no defined cause. Only the same time recorded on mechanical objects near the bodies. About that Thomas Hargreave, he became a constant presence. He didn't interfere openly, but he always appeared whenever Elias went too far. His demeanor indicated a man torn between duty and loyalty to the city. Thomas knew more than he let on, and he knew exactly what to avoid. The antagonism between the two wasn't explicit, it was silent, built through omissions. Each incomplete report, each denied access, each unanswered question reinforced the tension. Thomas didn't want to stop Elias out of malice, but out of fear of the consequences. The factory space itself functioned as a character. The narrow corridors seemed to direct the movement, as if certain routes were unavoidable. Some areas remained surprisingly preserved, while others were almost completely destroyed. The boiler room, where Margaret had been found, bearer of soot marks that did not match the official fire recorded in the files. Elias began to realize that the 1899 disaster had been carefully simplified. In the technical documents he managed to recover, he noticed inconsistencies in shifts, changes in schedules, and repeated signatures on different reports. His father's name appeared with excessive frequency, always associated with decisions made shortly before the fire. This realization altered Elias's internal conflict. He was no longer just investigating a series of strange deaths. He was confronting the possibility that his own story was directly linked to what the city was hiding. Secondary characters emerged as fragments of the same collective trauma. Walter Innes, a former factory watchman, now living in isolation, unable to sleep at night. Clara Hemsley, a retired nurse who treated recurring nervous breakdowns in workers decades ago. Jonah Pike, the owner of the only bar still in operation, who knew how to listen without ever commenting. Each person contributed small details, never complete answers, as if they all shared the same unspoken agreement. Revealing too much could reignite something that had never truly ended. Local culture reinforced this fear. Superstitions disguised as traditions, avoided times of day, places never frequented after a certain hour of the night. Not as an outright mystical belief, but as an inherited habit, passed down from generation to generation without explanation. Elias understood that Black Hollow did not fear ghosts. I was afraid memory. And the more he connected the characters to the factory's past, the clearer it became that the true antagonist wasn't a specific person, but a system of decisions, silences and choices made in the name of progress. Choices whose consequences still lingered beneath the cracked concrete of the block. The city was not cursed. He was poorly resolved. Elias's investigation ceased to be silent the moment he attempted to access the factory's remaining technical records. The request, formally made to the City Hall, generated an immediate reaction. Papers disappeared. Doors that had previously remained merely closed were now locked. The city reacted like a threatened organism. That same night, someone entered the room where Elijah was staying. Nothing was taken. No object had been moved in any obvious way. Still, he knew he hadn't been alone. The suitcase had been opened, his notebooks leafed through, and Margaret's watch, carefully stored away, had been placed in the center of the table, perfectly aligned, like a reminder. Elias did not report what happened. He preferred to observe. The next day he returned to the factory, this time accompanied by Ruth Calder. Her presence was no accident. Ruth knew the routes that avoided unstable areas and knew exactly where the fire had been officially contained, and where, according to oral accounts, the fire should never have reached. That's where they found something new. Behind a partially collapsed wall, a compartment appeared that was not included in any official plans. An improvised technical space containing manual valves and pressure gauges that indicated deliberate manipulation. It was not a structural failure. It was human intervention. The discovery shifted the focus of the conflict. If the fire was not accidental, then the current deaths were not random. Meanwhile, Thomas Hargreave intensified his surveillance. He began to follow Elias more closely, under the pretext of ensuring his safety. The tension between the two finally materialized in concrete actions: restricted access, constant presence, subtle interruptions during interviews. Thomas wasn't lying. He just chose what not to say. The conflict took on a new dimension when Walter Innes, the former watchman, was found unconscious near the factory's secondary entrance. He wasn't dead, but his condition was critical. The watch hanging from his coat, an old-fashioned wind-up model, had stopped at 3A17. Unlike the other victims, Walter survived, and this represented a dangerous break from the pattern. Elias realized that the phenomenon, whatever it was not infallible. Something had interfered, and this interference was linked to the exposure time, the proximity of certain spaces, and possibly prior knowledge of what had actually occurred in 1899. The interviews became more tense. People who had previously agreed to speak now refused. Others distorted information they had already provided. Fear ceased to be passive and began to take action. Ruth, in turn, revealed something that completely changed the emotional balance of the investigation. She had found an old hospital record with the name of Samuel Crowford, Elias's father, dated a few days after the fire. The document indicated hospitalization for severe nervous breakdown, followed by unauthorized discharge. Samuel had not disappeared. He was removed. This revelation placed Elias directly at the center of the conflict. What had previously been an external investigation now implicated him as the heir to decisions that may have cost dozens of lives. His objectivity began to falter, not out of fear, but out of urgency. The city noticed this change. The following night, the factory emitted sounds again. Not supernatural noises, but mechanical cracking, like metal against metal, even though no machines were operating. Elias was present when this occurred. He observed the old gauges vibrating slightly, as if responding to a non-existent pressure. Rationality began to wear thin. The main conflict ceased to be simply about discovering the cause of death and began to revolve around a more dangerous question: who benefits from the silence? Under pressure, Thomas partially revealed his motivation. The fire had claimed entire families. Revealing the truth would mean destroying what little remained of the city. lawsuits, abandonment, total ruin. For him, keeping the past buried was a form of collective survival. Elias disagreed. Each obstacle now came with physical and psychological risk. The city no longer offered neutrality. The forces at play, human and structural, pushed Elias toward an inevitable choice: retreat and preserve silence, or advance and provoke irreversible consequences. The conflict was fully established, and there was no longer room for investigation without confrontation. As the main conflict solidified, parallel stories began to emerge, not as diversions, but as inevitable extensions of the same collective trauma. Each subplot revealed a different consequence of the fire and the silence that followed. The first one involved Clara Hemsley. Clara, a retired nurse, began visiting her regularly, not seeking direct confessions, but to observe patterns. Clara never spoke of the fire itself. She spoke of the days that followed, of the improvised care provided, of the burned hands that were not recorded in official records, of the patients who were discharged without ever having been formally admitted. In her actions, it was clear that Clara carried guilt, not through omission, but through survival. She had obeyed orders, signed papers, adjusted schedules. Each gesture was too small to seem criminal in isolation, but together they had constructed a functional lie. Another subplot revolved around Jonah Pike. The bar owner Elias was there. The place served as a social hub for the city. There he noticed that certain men never sat together, even though they shared the same story. Former factory supervisors occupied opposite tables, avoiding eye contact. The division wasn't ideological, but hierarchical, a reflection of the decisions made that night. Jonah never interfered, but his willingness to allow Elias to observe was already a choice. He had lost a brother in the fire. He wasn't seeking justice, just closure that never came. The pressure of time began to manifest itself concretely when Ruth Calder discovered that the city government planned to officially demolish the building in less than 2 weeks. The justification was public safety. The real motivation was simpler: erase the physical space before the investigation could turn it into evidence. This countdown rearranged all the actions. Elias no longer had the luxury of slowly analyzing each clue. Every lost day represented irretrievable information. Walter Innes, still recovering, became a critical subplot. His state oscillated between lucidity and extreme confusion. In moments of clarity, he always repeated the same gestures. He drew incomplete maps of the factory, always omitting the boiler room, and obsessively crossed out schedules. These weren't delusions, they were fragments. Elias realized that Walter had been deliberately moved that night in 1899. His lookout post had been changed minutes before the fire. He had survived not by chance, but by being removed from the most critical point. The greater complexity arose when Elias began to recognize similar emotional patterns among the survivors. They had all been placed in positions where they didn't see the whole picture. Each person possessed only part of the information, making a complete reconstruction impossible without collective collaboration. This fragmentation was the true mechanism of control. The city had functioned like this ever since. Nobody knew enough to act alone, and nobody trusted each other enough to act together. Thomas Hargreave, for his part, faced his own subplot. State pressure to solve the case was mounting, and his position was becoming untenable. He was not the architect of silence, but its ultimate guardian. Every choice he made to protect the city now distanced him from the law he had sworn to uphold. The environment reacted to the growing tension, not in a supernatural way, but structurally. Small collapses, old pipes bursting, clocks malfunctioning in specific locations. The physical space seemed to respond to the proximity of the truth. The subplots converged on the same point. The fire was only the beginning. The real traumatic event was collective decision not to resolve. And with the demolition imminent, all the parallel storylines were pushed toward a forced closure, either incomplete or violent. Time wasn't just passing by. I was putting pressure on them. The turning point came abruptly, without dramatic warning, as is often the case with events that truly alter the course of things. There were no speeches, no emotional preparation, just a sequence of actions that, added together, made any return to the previous state impossible. It all started when the demolition of the building was brought forward by 48 hours. The decision was not announced publicly. Elias learned about it from Ruth Calder, who found the signed and filed authorization outside of normal business hours. This was not just administrative haste. It was a deliberate attempt to end the investigation before it reached something irreversible. That same night, Elias entered the factory for the last time without authorization. He was no longer looking for formal proof. He was looking for understanding. As he walked through the corridors, he noticed that certain areas were more stable than they should be. Makeshift structures, reinforcements made after the fire, but never documented. The factory hadn't simply been abandoned. It had been partially rebuilt to conceal something. In the boiler room, Elias found what would change everything. Beneath crudely welded metal plates lay an underground compartment, accessible only by a narrow ladder. Down there, the air was dense and dry, preserving the environment in an anomalous way. In the center of the space was a set of manual valves connected to an independent steam release system. The mechanism was not included in any official blueprints, and there were no signs of failure. It was an emergency containment system designed for isolate workers in specific areas, under the justification of preventing larger explosions, an extreme solution, and a lethal one. Among the records left there, technical notes, handwritten markings, hastily made corrections, there was a recurring signature, Samuel Crowford. The revelation wasn't accompanied by visible shock. Elias didn't fall, didn't scream, didn't despair. The impact came in another form, clarity. His father hadn't just been complicit with the system. He had been its main technical executor. The 1899 fire was neither an accident nor an inevitable structural collapse. It was the result of a calculated decision to contain a larger problem, serious flaws in the main boiler, which, if exposed, would have shut down the factory and ruined influential investors. Isolate some to save many. This logic permeated every valve, every register, every rushed weld. Elias then understood why clocks stopped at 3:17. That was the exact moment when the system was activated for the first time. Time did not repeat itself as a curse, but because mechanical memory, a traumatic event, inscribed in the functioning of the space, replicated whenever someone remained too long in the isolated areas. The factory wasn't haunted. He was reenacting. The final revelation came when Elias found a medical record hidden among the technical documents. Samuel Crowford had been hospitalized not for a nervous breakdown, but for attempting to denounce the system. Upon realizing the true number of deaths, he had tried to expose the system. He was silenced, declared unstable, and removed from the city. The collective silence had not only protected the city, it protected investors, authorities, and a model of progress built on secrecy. Upon leaving the factory, Elias was confronted by Thomas Hargreave. There was no physical confrontation, only recognition. Thomas already knew. He had always known. His role had been to ensure that no one ever remained in the block long enough to reconstruct the complete truth. With demolition imminent, the revelation placed Elias before an irreversible choice. Expose everything and provoke devastating consequences, or allow the block to be destroyed, definitively ending the cycle, at the cost of the truth. The turning point had been reached. The story was now heading towards a conclusion that would not allow for neutrality. The revelation did not produce an immediate explosion. It produced silence, a silence heavier than any previous secret, because now it was not sustained by ignorance, but by conscious choice. Elias didn't leave the factory as someone who had won. He left as someone who understood too late. In the hours that followed, his actions became methodical. He didn't rush to denounce, didn't confront the press, didn't seek outside allies. Instead, he began organizing the documents he found, separating what was technical from what was human. Each record carried enough weight to bring down careers, but also to destroy the city. Ruth Calder was the first to react. Upon hearing the full explanation, she showed no surprise. She showed exhaustion. Her reaction was not moral, but practical. She asked what would remain of Black Hollow after the truth came to light. Closed libraries, abandoned houses, families who survived the fire being punished again, now through public exposure. The most immediate consequence was active fear. People began leaving the city even before any official announcement. They weren't fleeing justice, but memory. The past, once named, became impossible to ignore. Thomas Hargreave confronted his own internal reaction. For the first time, he removed Elias from direct surveillance, not out of trust, but out of partial surrender. He understood that the role of guardian had failed the moment the truth was reconstructed. Even so, Thomas made a practical decision. He delayed the demolition for another 24 hours, officially for technical reasons, in reality to give Elias time to decide the fate of the information. Walter Innes had a different reaction. Upon regaining some lucidity, upon hearing what had truly happened, he did not show relief. He demonstrated coherence. His lapses were not due to guilt, but to the result of having lived on the margins of an incomplete truth. Knowing the whole story did not cure him, but it stabilized him. The pattern of deaths has ceased. No clock stopped again. The factory, deprived of the human repetition that reactivated its traumatic mechanism, became merely a condemned building. The phenomenon did not feed on the supernatural, but on permanence. Absence interrupted the cycle. Elias then realized the most disturbing consequence of all. The truth did not require immediate justice to function. It was enough to be understood. The city reacted in layers. Some residents began to speak openly. Others closed themselves off even further. There was no emotional unity, only exposed fractures. Ruth began cataloging documents, not for publication but for preservation. A controlled memory, kept out of the immediate reach of physical destruction. It was an attempt at balance, not to erase but not to explode. Elias felt the weight of his legacy. His father hadn't been an isolated monster, but neither had he been merely a cog in the machine. He had made choices, and choices have consequences, even after death. The question that dominated every gesture now was not what happened, but what should survive. Exposing everything would mean definitively breaking the cycle of silence, but also transforming Black Hollow into a national symbol of industrial horror. Not exposing it would mean allowing the pattern to end without public accountability. Both options had victims. The consequences didn't manifest as violence, but as strain, in sleepless nights, in postponed decisions, in relationships that would never return to their previous state. The conflict had changed form. It was no longer external. It was ethical. Elias's overcoming of his challenges did not occur through visible redemption or immediate heroic acts. His growth came from discrete choices made under constant pressure, without guarantees of recognition or absolution. He started with what was within his reach. During the early morning hours before the deadline given by Thomas, Elias returned to the factory not to investigate, but to close, not physically, but functionally. Using his technical knowledge, he deactivated the hidden valve system, not as one who erases a crime, but as one who prevents its repetition. The mechanism would no longer be activated. Even if someone remained in the location for too long, there was no satisfaction, only need. This action marked a clear shift in his behavior. Before, Elias sought to understand without becoming emotionally involved. Now he accepted that neutrality is also a choice, and a dangerous one. His growth became evident in how he began to interact with the people of the city. He stopped questioning and started listening. He was no longer looking for pieces to complete a puzzle, but for human consequences that needed to be acknowledged. With Ruth Calder, the relationship evolved from intellectual complicity to shared responsibility. Together, they decided to separate the documents into 3 sets: the technical, the administrative, and the testimonial. This organization was not bureaucratic, it was strategic. It would allow the truth to be revealed in layers without destroying everything at once. Ruth, for her part, grew by abandoning the role of mere guardian of the past. For the first time, she took the risk of allowing memory to have a future. Thomas Hargreave faced his challenge quietly. He began to cooperate, not with words, but with practical actions. He granted access, signed overdue permits, and stopped interfering. His growth was not morally redemptive, but functional. He accepted that protecting the city now meant allowing it to change. Walter Innes represented the most painful growth. With fragments of the truth finally connected, he ceased to be merely a survivor and became a witness. His recovery was not complete, but it was enough to break his self-imposed isolation. When he redrew the factory maps, he now included the boiler room. This did not erase the trauma, but he organized it. Elias also faced the direct weight of his paternal legacy. For the first time, he spoke Samuel Crawford's name aloud in the city, not to accuse, but to acknowledge. Growth came from recognizing the complexity. His father had been responsible and at the same time disposable to the system that used him. This understanding distanced Elias from the need for simplistic condemnations. The final challenge of this phase arose when Elias received a response from Chicago. His superiors demanded a formal report, not a moral narrative, but verifiable facts. The request forced Elias to reconsider his decision. He could no longer postpone it indefinitely. He began to write. The report was neither a complete indictment nor a comfortable omission. It was a precise technical document describing the system, the decisions, the long-term effects. No adjectives, no dramatization, just causality. This was the real growth, to assume responsibility without control over the outcome. By the end of this phase, Elias was no longer the investigator who had returned to the city to solve a mystery. He had become someone capable of accepting that some truths do not liberate. They only compel one to act with greater awareness. Overcoming the challenge did not bring peace, it brought clarity, and that would be essential for what was to come. With the report underway and the demolition scheduled for the following day, time ceased to be an abstract threat and began to dictate every move. There was no longer room for lengthy reconsiderations or extensive moral debates. Everything now converged on a final decision. Elias realized that preparation did not require new discoveries, but closures. The first subplot to be resolved was that of Walter Innes. Elias brought him a summarized copy of the technical report, not for publication, but for acknowledgement. Walter read it silently, with difficulty, but without interruption. At the end, he signed the document as an indirect technical witness. The gesture had no full legal value, but it possessed symbolic weight. It was confirmation that someone who had been there had survived to name what happened. Next, Elias and Ruth finalized the parallel archiving process. The most sensitive documents were sealed in labeled boxes, destined for an out-of-state institution, with clear instructions on when they could be opened. It wasn't censorship, it was conscious containment, a calculated delay, not an erasure. Thomas Hargreave made his final choice as police chief of Black Hollow. He altered the official demolition record, ensuring the boiler room would be preserved for a few extra hours under the guise of a final structural inspection. He didn't explain it to anyone. He just acted. It would cost him his job, but he accepted the price. The atmosphere reflected the tension. The city seemed suspended, as if awaiting an imminent impact. Houses remained lit late into the night. People walked more than usual, observing the block from a distance, like someone bidding farewell to something they never knew how to confront. Elias reviewed the report one last time that night. Every sentence was a decision, every omission a risk. He knew the climax wouldn't come from the demolition itself, but from destination of the information. His inner growth manifested itself in accepting this reality. He no longer sought to control the narrative. He sought to ensure that it existed. Shortly before dawn, Elias entered the factory for the last time, now accompanied by Thomas, not to investigate, but to verify the definitive shutdown of the system. They confirmed that the valves were inoperative, the registers unusable, the mechanism incapable of repeating the event. There were no words of parting. As he left, Elias paused for a moment and observed Margaret Bellow's pocket watch, now functioning again after minor technical adjustments. Time had begun to flow again, not through healing, but through closure. The final preparation involved a choice that had not yet been announced to anyone. Elias had decided to deliver two versions of the report. One official, technical version addressed to federal authorities. The other, sealed, with instructions for future opening, containing names, administrative decisions, and human consequences. This development would create an impact in two phases. The climax would not be immediate. It would be inevitable. As the sun began to rise behind the factory structure, Elias knew there was nothing more he could do. Everything that needed to be done was already underway. All that remained was to face the moment when the choices would no longer be his. The preparation was complete. The climax didn't begin with the factory explosion, nor with sirens or crowds. It began with the arrival of federal inspectors at Black Hollow shortly before noon. Two official vehicles, too discreet for an event that would end more than a decade of organized silence. Elias received them neither as accuser nor as defender. He delivered the technical report with surgical precision, aware that each page had been constructed to withstand denials. There were no interpretations, only a logical sequence of decisions, mechanisms, and effects. Meanwhile, the demolition continued. The initial impact on the block didn't generate excessive dust. The structure gave way as something already tired of existing. But when the team reached the boiler area, something unexpected happened. The old pressure sensors, which should have been completely inactive, registered one last residual variation. It wasn't working. It was liberation. The system did not reactivate, it unloaded. The steam, trapped for decades, found its way out, not violently, but continuously, like a prolonged sigh. The sound traveled through the city deep and low, causing people to leave their homes without understanding why. To the 3:17 p.m. knot in the morning, the clock on the town hall tower stopped for a few seconds, and it started working again. The moment symbolically marked the end of the cycle. Time stopped repeating the trauma and began to record it as past. The real climax, however, occurred outside the factory. By cross-referencing technical data with old financial records, the inspectors identified the final link. The investors who had pushed for the activation of the emergency system in 1899 still existed as an active industrial conglomerate. The story wasn't dead. It was just hidden under another name. Elias was summoned to give a formal statement. There, his transformation became visible. He didn't speak as a son, nor as an indirect victim. He spoke as someone who understood the systemic cost of technical decisions. He named responsibilities without dramatizing. He didn't ask for punishment. He simply refused to be erased. The final twist came when Thomas Hargreave voluntarily handed over a set of documents he had kept out of official files, records of verbal orders, undocumented instructions, dates and names. He chose to go down with the truth. The action dismantled any attempt at institutional containment. There was no longer any way to reduce the event to historical failures. The demolition is over. The block ceased to exist physically, but its contents had become irremovable. At the height of the climax, Elias realized that the horror of 1912, the one that no one could explain, had never been in the sounds, the deaths, or the stopped clocks. It had been in the human capacity to repeat a tragedy while claiming to be rational. The surprise was not that the system existed. It was the reason it had worked for so long without being questioned. The climax brought an end to the central conflict, not with immediate justice, but with irreversible exposure. The past could no longer be contained by walls, signatures, or collective silence. The cycle was broken, and the cost of that was beginning to become apparent. With the block reduced to rubble and the inspectors leaving Black Hollow, the town entered a strange state of forced continuity. Nothing else happened, but nothing had been fully resolved. The conclusion brought no collective catharsis, only gradual consequences. The following weeks were marked by silent changes. Some families left the town permanently, unable to remain in a place that now had a name and a recognized history. Others stayed, not out of attachment, but out of a conscious choice to rebuild. Black Hollow ceased to be just a physical space and became a moral legacy. Elias's technical report followed its institutional course. Investigations were opened outside the state, far from the eyes of the city, but their effects began to return in the form of letters, notifications, and formal requests for testimony. The horror of 1912 no longer belonged solely to local memory. It had become part of a larger debate about progress, accountability, and concealment. Thomas Hargreave left his post unceremoniously. He was neither arrested nor publicly acquitted. His departure was functional, not symbolic. He remained in the city, now as an ordinary man, accepting the loss of authority as part of the price for having delayed the truth for too long. Ruth Calder transformed the library into a hybrid space, archive and memorial. There were no explicit exhibitions, only documents accessible under clear criteria. Memory ceased to be clandestine, it became searchable. This was her way of closing it down. Walter Innes never fully recovered his health, but he began walking around the city during the day. His nighttime isolation ceased. The past, once organized, stopped invading every moment. Elias remained in Black Hollow for some time longer, not out of obligation, but out of responsibility. He sought neither personal absolution nor reconciliation with his father's legacy. His ultimate growth manifested in the acceptance that understanding does not mean forgiving, and exposing does not mean destroying, provided it is done consciously. The city was not redeemed. It has been clarified, and that changed everything. Black Hollow now existed without the weight of the inexplicable. The horror had been named, contextualized, and inserted into human history where it had always belonged. Time moved forward, without symbolic pauses, without mechanical repetitions. Just time. And for a city that had lived trapped in a single instant, this was the most profound closure possible. Years later, the land where the block once stood remained empty. No monument was erected, no explanatory plaque, just leveled earth and uneven grass, as if the space refused to be fully appropriated. A visiting researcher, consulting Ruth Calder's archives, jotted down something simple in his notebook. The horror of 1912 was neither supernatural nor accidental. It was administrative. In Black Hollow, the clocks continued to run, and that was enough. Stories like Black Hollow don't end when the last paragraph is written. They continue every time someone chooses to remember, question, and refuse easy explanations. If this account has provoked reflection, share your impressions, your doubts, or your interpretation of the events. What disturbed you most, the mechanism, the silence, or human choices? If this story touched you, leave a comment and share it with others who also enjoy realistic and disturbing narratives. Your participation keeps alive stories that should never be forgotten.